Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Today we are joined with Mr. Jim Shea, Democratic candidate for governor in the state of Maryland. So, Mr. Shea, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
My name is Shannon Coleman Siciliano. I serve as co-executive director for Strong Schools Maryland. Strong Schools Maryland is a 501c3 organization with a mission to ensure that public school students in Maryland have a world-class education. And if you'd like more information, you can visit our website at www.strongschoolsmaryland.org. So over the course of the next couple of weeks, we're going to be hosting a series of Facebook Lives with the gubernatorial candidates. And we want to highlight public education and the Kirwan Commission recommendations. Now, we do not support a particular candidate, nor do we support a particular party. But what we do believe is that the candidate strongest on education and on the Kirwan Commission will win the election. So no pressure. A little bit of background about the Kirwan Commission. The Kirwan Commission developed a comprehensive comprehensive set of policy recommendations for public education in Maryland. And this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to ensure that we are providing an intentional and equitable way to prepare our students to be engaged as citizens and prepare them for their career and education beyond high school. And the commission believes that it's not only important about what or how we fund our schools and the financing that goes behind them, but also what we are doing with the money and the policies that are implemented. So in other words, the policy is just as important as the financing. So we're going to get started here looking at some of your policies, and we want to know what you intend to do should you become governor to support outcomes equitably for students in Maryland. So I'm going to start kind of broad with the Maryland State Constitution. The Maryland State Constitution requires a thorough and efficient system for free public education for our schools. And the courts define this as enabling all students to meet state standards. And so what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it's important and notable that Maryland has in its constitution this principle. And to me, it means that every child should have an adequate and equitable education. That is to say, good enough to accomplish what's needed in life, and fair in that it's equal among all the students. And fundamentally, that means for pre-K through 12, that when a young person finishes high school, he or she should be ready for a career or to go ahead to college or community college.
And do you think that we're meeting that standard today?
No.
Why not?
Well, it's hard to tell why not. There's probably a series of reasons, but certainly one of them is underfunding, and the current governor has chronically underfunded education, and we haven't funded it for a long time at the level it needs to be, notwithstanding the Thornton Commission's efforts in that regard.
Okay, thank you. So moving deeper and looking specifically at the Kirwan Commission recommendations, they establish a set of recommendations based around 5 policy areas. The policy areas include early childhood education, high quality teachers and leaders, college and career readiness and pathways, more resources for at-risk students, and governance and accountability. At Strong Schools Maryland, we believe that each of these policy initiatives is important and that they are an entire set, meaning that you can't just pick one or two popular programs or implement one or two pilot programs. And we think that we cannot accomplish our goals unless the next governor actually implements the entire set of recommendations. And so what is your reaction to that?
I'm 100% on board, 150% if that were possible.
Okay.
I have a plan, a comprehensive plan. The Baltimore Sun called it comprehensive and bold plan for education, which is very similar in many respects to the Kirwan Commission. And it embraces the principle that you can't cherry pick among these. We need the full package for a complete redo, top to bottom. And similarly, I think implicit in the Kirwan Commission's work and its output, I don't think we can cherry pick between funding and best practices. I think we need to do both. To simply put more money into a system that's not operating properly is not a good idea. These recommendations will enable the system to work properly and will mean that we'll all benefit from the increased funding.
And so when you read the policy recommendations, were there any that stood out to you as particularly powerful?
Well, having said they're all important and we need every one of them, I hesitate to advance one over the others. But perhaps because of my experiences, and I think most of us feel like our education was accelerated and benefited by a great teacher or set of teachers. So for me, the career path, the recruiting and the career path for teachers to advance, to get paid better without having to leave the classroom, to me that's probably the one that catches my eye the most.
Now, thinking also about the policies, were there any recommendations that gave you pause, if it was either based off of substance or any financial implications that you saw?
Well, in a sense, they all should give us all pause. This is hard. This is not easy. We're not going to be able overnight to do all of these things and in a couple of years have it done and fund it all completely. So I respect the challenge here, but the payoff is so enormous. As to the Commission's recommendation, the one recommendation that I fully agree with and embrace is governance and accountability. I didn't quite get the gist of what the new criteria will be so that our governance system can properly review each school's or each district's efforts. So that's sort of nitpicking on the report itself. I hope that as we proceed, there'll be a little more detail on that particular recommendation.
Yeah, and starting at the end of this month, the Commission will be reconvening and their small groups will break out. So hopefully we will get more answers around that.
Yeah.
So we, as you know, we reached out to our members within the Strong Schools Maryland community. And we asked them, what questions do they have? And a lot of them raised concern around coordinated care, community schools, and additional support such as school nurses and school counselors.
Right.
But specifically, the Kerwin Commission, they recommended the expansion of community schools, which includes a full-time coordinator and after-school programming for schools that, in response to schools that experience concentrated poverty. And so, if you become the governor of Maryland,
right,
what would you do to ensure that the public schools are fully funded with the necessary staff and resources beyond the classroom for our students?
Right, and when you asked me to single out a particular policy, the need for additional resources and programs for areas of concentrated poverty is hugely important. We'll never do what we want as a society unless we educate everybody and bring us all together, both from an economic and cultural point of view. It's so important. To fund all of this, including particularly that for the community schools, a couple things. First of all, education is and will be my top priority. And when that's so, and you actually carry that out, when you face a budget, you fund the education first. You fund it. The other things that are important and need doing are things you may or may not do. But in this area, and particularly with respect to at-risk and low-income children, top priority, they're going to get the funds. And then we'll worry about all the other things like transportation that need to be taken care of.
So they'll get the funds in addition to what impacts
yes,
the direct classroom, but the
yes,
support.
I'm anticipating that the Kerwin Commission's second phase that comes up with a funding formula will give additional funds for districts that are dealing with concentrated poverty. I'm assuming that's so, and I feel certain that it will. We will fund things like summer programs and after-school programs and community schools. I think there are 10 community schools, maybe a dozen in Baltimore City. Experience shows they work really well. We're going to make sure we fund more of those, many more, and outside of Baltimore as well. And that will involve services across the board, not just for the children, but for their families as well, to make sure that when the child gets to the classroom, he or she is ready to learn, that we've handled the physical, emotional, home problems that keep so many children from being ready to learn.
And you mentioned concentrated poverty, and Strong Schools Maryland, we have a sheet that shows that it's not just Baltimore that experiences concentrated poverty, that almost every county in our state has some form of that.
Oh, absolutely, and a lot.
Yes.
And there are a number of jurisdictions other than Baltimore City that have 100%
Right.
Free and reduced lunch schools.
Exactly. Thank you. And so transitioning and keeping in line around concentrated poverty, I want us to focus really on equity here. And equity, it remains a constant area of focus for Strong Schools Maryland and for our members. But before I get to a question that I want to ask you, I kind of just want to get clear about the facts as it exists in our state currently. So Maryland is not doing what we need to be doing to educate all of our students across the board, no matter where they come from. If you look at standards based nationally or internationally, benchmarks and tests, our students are underperforming, and they are performing actually middle in line with their peers. And we think, the state of Maryland can do much better than that. And again, this is true for all of Maryland students. But then if you look even deeper, district by district and school by school, and you look at what we're doing or not doing for Black and brown students, for students with a disability, for students with English as a second language, and students living in concentrated poverty, it's abysmal, actually, what we're doing as a state. And our thought is we need to think more than just about giving additional funding to support those students. In order to have transformational and equitable change, we need to think about policies that are going to directly impact those students. And so my question to you is, what specific Kerwin recommendations do you think would most likely address those inequities that we see?
Very, very good question. And just to set the context a little bit, Maryland ranks in the middle of the United States as a state as a whole. And that's not good. But worse is the United States, when compared to other countries around the world, is also in the middle of the pack. So for our students, we're talking about not giving them an education that's going to enable them to compete globally. When we get to the question of equity, it is shocking to me and completely unacceptable that today we provide more public money to schools that serve low-income children or high-income children than we give to schools that serve high-income children. More to the high-income, less to the low-income. I think I turned that around at least twice. But the point is, we should give more money to areas of concentrated poverty where there are more needs, as we've clearly established. So right now, our funding is backwards. It's regressive rather than progressive. But good funding is what we need in part. But we also need the other things. We've already talked about the community schools and after school programs and summer programs. All of that's needed. But let's take teachers for a second, because I picked that out as the most important or the most prominent policy. In schools around the world, the really good teachers are the ones that teach the children who are most at risk, the low-income children, those that are dealing with a second language. Here in the United States, our best teachers gravitate towards the high-income children and the more advanced children. We need to make sure our great teachers teach those children who can benefit the most from that great teaching. So that's just an example of what it is we're talking about.
Okay, and I want to highlight, with equities, again, since this is an area of clear focus for us, is that when we talk about equity across the state, a lot of the focus tends to be on students who experience poverty. But, we just want to make it clear that in addition to students that experience poverty or living in concentrated poverty, there are inequities based on race. If you look at data and outcomes for our students, even if those students are not living in concentrated poverty, the gaps are, again, abysmal. Students that have English as a second language. And so, we encourage the next governor to be thinking about policies that are not just going to impact concentrations of poverty, but other issues of equity.
Again, you have me on board, and I'd add special ed
Yes.
special ed kids in that area too. No, this is part of the accountability. We're gonna put into place these policy initiatives, but then part of the program would be to measure ourselves as we go forward, and where we see that we're failing children of color, or we're failing special ed children, or children with English as a second language, then we move in and fix. That's the whole point of accountability. Sometimes people think accountability means blame. It's not. It's to identify where you need to do better and apply the resources that are needed to do that.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about funding. So we know a bit about your policy and your policy beliefs around Kerwin, but we also need to know about what is your financial commitment to this work. So the full cost of the Kerwin policy recommendations has not been released, but the state did a study, and we know that we need $2.9 billion in additional funding from state and local jurisdictions in order to adequately educate our students. And so how do you plan to meet this funding requirement for the Kerwin Commission?
Well, I've already mentioned that making education my highest priority means that we'll take care of the education needs first. But beyond that, because your question calls for more than just I'll pay them first, it will require a steady persistence to make sure all of these policies are put into play, and that the proper level of funding is applied, and that the right level of accountability accompanies that. That does mean prioritization, but it also means a couple other things. If I'm governor, one of the things I will work real hard to do, and these improvements in education will aid me, is to grow the economy. The economy's doing okay now because the nation's economy is doing better, but Maryland's actually lagging under Governor Hogan in job creation behind the national average and in wages. We need a robust economy that generates a lot of revenue for education and other things to be done. I will push that very hard. I have, again, a published plan for economic development. There are also revenue streams that can be captured. One good example is the casino money. When the casino were allowed to proceed, the deal was they were going to give the money that they produced to the schools. Well, it turned out they, instead of supplementing the school allocation, it's substituted for, and what was put in was taken out, and there was a net no gain. So I think the General Assembly went a long ways towards fixing that by creating a lockbox. But there will be other new sources of revenue that we will encounter as things proceed. And as they occur, one of them is online sports gambling is likely to be state regulated and taxed. We can capture at least a part of that stream to make sure that we have enough funding going into the schools.
Thank you. And we know that at this point it may be too early to identify all of the exact streams and additional revenue sources that you will commit to. But what we want to be clear at Strong Schools Maryland is a commitment to ensuring that Kerwin and education is fully funded.
I am committed. Completely.
Okay, great. So let's talk about accountability. You mentioned that earlier. Maryland, we've increased funding in education before, and we haven't seen the outcomes that we should be seeing. And so what would you do different in relationship to governance and accountability if you were to be governor?
Right. Well, the first thing to do is to make sure that the full package is passed by the General Assembly. And come January 2019, if I'm governor, I will have a legislative package prepared and ready to be submitted to the General Assembly that will include each of these things: early childhood intervention, a better career path for teachers, a principal pipeline, more resources for at-risk students, a better vocational education system, and governance and account. All this will be ready to go, and we can succeed this time because we've got the best practices, and we will succeed because we're going to enact them all and not just some of them. When it comes to actual structure of governance and accountability, As I understand it, the Maryland's education system is fractionalized, I think is the word that's used. It's very decentralized, and it's spread all over the state, so that there is no hierarchy of review, no final say from a group or person that are responsible for applying the accountability, and as I mentioned earlier, no clear set of policies and criteria by which we know what we're supposed to do. You need that. You need to say, here's what we want, so that everybody knows it, all the schools, and then there needs to be a review consistent with that, applying those criteria.
Okay. And what specific steps will you take to demonstrate that the Kerwin recommendations are your top priority?
Well, I just mentioned that come January 2019, as soon as I'm in, I'm going to have a complete legislative package ready to go that has the best practices and the funding formula ready to be passed. So I don't think there's going to be any mistake about my commitment. I think what I need to demonstrate is my ability to deliver on that commitment. And I think my career as chair of the university system, my career in running large organizations, both public and private, the comprehensiveness of my plan, I think, demonstrates that I can be effective in discharging that commitment.
Okay. So I'm going to end with a set of questions around your vision. We want to know, what's your vision for students in the state of Maryland? So should you become governor at the end of your 4-year term, what would success for Maryland schools and students look like at the end of your term?
Yeah. Well, let me begin by saying this effort of doing what we're talking about and the Kerwin Commission is talking about will not be accomplished in 4 years. If we go into it thinking that, we will fail. Massachusetts committed to a similar set of policies and achieved them, and is today #1 in the U.S. in education and #1 in economic development, no surprise. But it took years for Massachusetts to accomplish that. They started in 1983 and stuck with it over a long period of time, and it took a number of governors to stick with it. So what I want by the end of 4 years is I want us to be off to a really good and solid start. I want that legislative package passed. I want the whole spectrum of the building blocks. I want the funding formula properly set up. I want to begin the process that will take a long time of recruiting more and more high-quality teachers by posting and encouraging posting job opportunities, by improving our teacher education programs. So I want to get started on that. I want to get money immediately to those at-risk students. But that's a long process of making sure that they've got the resources and then correcting what's wrong. If we think it's a quick fix, we won't succeed. And that accountability item is important because we need to measure our progress. And I want, by the end of 4 years, on each of these areas, for the policies to be in place, for the implementation to be underway, for the early successes achieved, and the groundwork for the long process of really turning this around in place.
So I want to push you a little bit more than just having things in place.
Right.
If you win as governor and 4 years, your term is up and you run again, what will you say was your clear win for the students?
We will have universal pre-K. We will have before kindergarten education available to areas of need. We will have a new pipeline of teachers. We will have more principals. We will have a curriculum that's benchmarked against international standards. We will have more community schools, many more. They will be in Baltimore and elsewhere. We will have after-school programs. We will have summer programs. Governor Hogan thinks it's good education policy to move the start date until after Labor Day. I think that's bad education policy, in addition to being superficial. But I will have real concrete accomplishments. And when I say it takes a long time, I'm only saying that the full job won't be done in 4 years. But in all these areas, we'll have the concrete accomplishments that I enumerated and many more.
And final question, it's open to you. Is there anything else that you want our Strong Schools Maryland community and other Marylanders that are listening today to know about your commitment to education and the Kerwin policy recommendations?
I can't emphasize too much how deeply I have thought about this. I was immersed in the world of education for 10 years, working with Britt Kerwin in the university system. I was chair for 4 years. I have thought through these things. I do have a comprehensive and bold plan already outlined that has these elements in it. I am committed and capable of discharging this enormous responsibility, but a great opportunity. I have the executive experience to accomplish it, and I'm going to put every ounce of experience and energy that I have into it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shea, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to our Strong Schools Maryland community for tuning in. And should you be elected governor, we look forward to working with you and ensuring that those things happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.